Tonight's speaker, Danny Postel, is senior editor of openDemocracy, an online magazine of politics and culture, and contributing editor to Daedalus, the Journal of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Tonight he will speak to us on his latest book, Legitimation Crisis in Tehran, Iran and the Future of Liberalism. So, welcome, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much, and let me express my gratitude to the Global Voices Program, the Center for International Studies, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and indeed to the Seminary Cooperative Bookstores, an institution of which I've been a member for close to 2 decades now, and which is actually one of the co-publishers of Prickly Paradigm Press, the series in which my pamphlet, as we somewhat playfully like to refer to our titles, appears. And I should also say that I was pleased, in a sense, to see that the title of my presentation this evening actually slightly got the title of my book wrong. My book is not actually titled Legitimation Crisis in Tehran. In fact, it's titled Reading Legitimation Crisis, and then the legitimation crisis either in italics or inverted commas or what have you. In other words, reading Jürgen Habermas's book, Legitimation Crisis in Tehran. And in the introduction, I actually explain why the book is not titled Legitimation Crisis, so perhaps that would be a good preamble to the rest of what I have to say tonight. So this book, or pamphlet, is about 4 overlapping themes. The widespread confusion on the Western left about Iran. Secondly, why the school of political thought that tends to resonate with and animate dissident intellectuals in Iran today is liberalism rather than Marxism. Thirdly, the tremendous vibrancy of the political and philosophical dialogue that have taken shape in Iran, and what lessons we might draw from this about the future of internationalism and solidarity. And fourthly, Michel Foucault's complex engagement with the Iranian Revolution of 1978 to 79, and how, in retrospect, we might make sense of that chapter. Now, I should say I also very much enjoy the title of the series in which I was invited to speak tonight, The World Beyond the Headlines. That's exactly the spirit of this study. And so first I'm going to start with some of the headlines that we're all too familiar with, although I wrote this back in sort of August, September. But things in many ways, of course, are very, very much the way they were then. Iran occupies center stage in an array of volatile and interrelated geopolitical dramas. The protracted international negotiations over Iran's nuclear program are but one of the dramas in play. Iran possesses, according to the BBC Middle East analyst Roger Hardy, what he calls five geopolitical cards above and beyond the nuclear one. It is, to one extent or another, a key player in Lebanon/Hezbollah, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, the global political economy of oil, the politics of Shiite minority communities in the Persian Gulf, and, of course, the devolving situation in Iraq. Looming over all of these dramas is the specter of a calamitous confrontation between Iran and the United States and/or Israel. There is agreement across the political spectrum that the Lebanon crisis, or war, of July-August 2006 was, if not an outright proxy war, a prefiguration of a larger conflict between Tehran and Washington. Though it is, of course, impossible to know at present precisely what form that conflict will take, whether, for example, the U.S. will launch a military attack on Iran. There is a pervasive sense that Iran and the U.S. are on some sort of collision course. Every few weeks seem to produce a new Seymour Hersh investigation in The New Yorker reporting the designs of some faction within the Pentagon to bomb Iran. Talk of a simmering regional conflict abounds, described varyingly in terms of a big war, a long war, even, quote, the beginning of World War III. The House organ of neoconservatism, the Weekly Standard, has in fact openly called for attacking Iran. Now, my own view, I should say, is that a military attack on Iran, though certainly not outside the realm of possibility, and definitely not beyond the wildest dreams of the neocons, to be sure, is nonetheless unlikely. The rhetoric of looming showdowns and enemies at the gates is pumped up by and serves the interests of both regimes. Posturing aside, Bush and Ahmadinejad are in fact involved in a symbiotic dance, a game of Schmittian shadow boxing, if you will, in which each needs the other as an enemy and feeds on one another's rhetoric. Washington's saber-rattling and fire-breathing provides, in the words of the Iranian journalist Bahman Nirumand, quote, just the ammunition they need to bring the masses into line in terms of ideology, religion, and nationalism, and to demand their solidarity with their country. Now, let there be absolutely no mistake. We must be adamant, unqualified opposition to military action of any kind against Iran. Among the strongest arguments that could be made against such an attack is that Iran's dissidents and human rights activists, the very forces in whose name the neocons speciously claim to speak, are themselves completely against any such attack. It's difficult for anti-war activists in the West to make that case, however, if we don't know anything about Iranian dissidents and human rights activists, if we aren't tuned in to what they're saying, let alone have direct contact with them. The "Don't Attack Iran" message found on many a button and bumper sticker these days is key, but only a partial position. It says what we're against, but what are we for? What, absent the threat of U.S. military intervention, would the Western left's position on Iran be exactly? So that's the headline parts. Now here's something of the beyond the headline parts. Largely obscured by this flurry and under the radar of the daily headlines, an ominous development is underway. 2006 has seen a massive crackdown on dissent and a precipitous deterioration of the human rights situation in Iran, in what some are calling a second cultural revolution and an attempt to, quote, reassert the values of 1979. Intellectuals, trade unionists, and student movement leaders have been imprisoned. Demonstrations have been violently crushed, newspapers have been closed, and human rights organizations have been banned. The Iranian philosopher Ramin Jahanbegloo, one of Iran's most prominent intellectual figures, was arrested in April and placed in solitary confinement for 4 months. Without bringing any formal charges against him, the regime floated vague accusations of contacts with foreigners and fomenting a soft or velvet revolution in Iran. As a condition of his release, Jahanbegloo was required to make a degrading confession of his so-called crimes. I should say that chapter 4, the closing chapter of this volume, consists of a rather extended dialogue between myself and Ramin Jahanbegloo that was conducted just before his arrest, though it came out while he was in prison. On May Day in Tehran, a rally of bus drivers was smashed by police and security forces, who arrested more than 10 union members and students who had joined them. The rally had been called to demand the reinstatement of nearly 200 union members who had been sacked following a strike in January, and also to demand the release of the union's imprisoned leader, Mansour Osanloo. In June in Tehran, A peaceful sit-in for women's rights was immediately broken up by police, who pepper-sprayed and beat participants with clubs. A former student leader and ex-member of parliament, Ali Akbar Mousavi Khoani, was arrested amidst the breakup and has been behind bars since. I should update that and say that he was recently released. At the time of this writing, he was still behind bars. In July, the student leader Akbar Mohammadi died in prison while on a hunger strike to protest his treatment, specifically his lack of access to medical care. His family believes that the severe beatings to which he was subjected led to his death. Another student leader, Ahmad Batebi, who had been out of prison briefly, was rearrested and taken to an undisclosed location where he is believed to be on hunger strike. And finally, in August, the organization headed by the human rights lawyer and Nobel Peace Laureate Shirin Ebadi, known as the Defenders of Human Rights Center, was banned, leading Ebadi to issue an urgent appeal to human rights supporters around the world to be on the alert and warning that her own arrest could be imminent. In September, Ahmadinejad announced a purge of liberal and secular instructors from Iran's universities, and the government's press supervisory board shut down the country's leading reform-oriented newspaper, Sharg, along with 3 other publications. Now, these developments are not unrelated to one another. An acute foreboding pervades Iran's intellectual and cultural landscape today. Quote, censorship of literature and the press, filtering of websites, the confiscation of satellite dishes, and censorship of film and theater are mounting day by day, declares the Iranian Writers Association. I should add that since I wrote that, Ahmadinejad has announced the banning of all Western films with, quote, feminist and secular messages. The Ahmadinejad government is establishing a climate of fear, rolling back the opening created during the reform period of 1997 to 2005 and redrawing the boundaries of public space in Iran. According to Bahman Nirumand, once again, anything that even hints at renewal, openness, and diversity faces censure. Commenting on the June, now this is the legitimation crisis part, commenting on the June women's rights demonstration that I mentioned earlier, the Iranian feminist Gulbarg Bashi wrote that the Ahmadinejad government, quote, appears far more intolerant of such grassroots movements which might indeed snowball to question the very constitutional foundation of the Islamic Republic. The brutality, this is still a quote from Bashi, the brutality and immediacy with which the demonstration was ruthlessly crushed speak of the increasing anxiety of the Islamic Republic about its prolonged legitimacy, unquote. Indeed, I contend that what we are witnessing in Iran today is precisely what Jürgen Habermas, in his felicitously titled 1975 book, termed a legitimation crisis. According to Habermas's longtime translator and interpreter Thomas McCarthy, a legitimation crisis occurs, quote, when the organizational principle of a society does not permit the resolution of problems that are critical for its continued existence. I should note that I quote McCarthy rather than the master himself, for reasons of style, shall we just say. Now, every day it becomes more evident that the organizational principle of the Islamic Republic indeed fails to permit the resolution of problems that are critical for its continued existence. What else are Ahmadinejad's widespread crackdown and ideological maneuvers, if not a desperate attempt to legitimate the Islamic Republic in the face of a civil society that has outgrown its strictures and passionately craves change? And herein lies the other half of the Habermasian equation. Crisis tendencies, again to quote McCarthy, are pregnant with the future. The seeds of the new society, he writes, are being formed in the womb of the old. Echoing this insight, Shadi Vatan Parast, a promoter of underground music in Tehran, likens developments in Iran today to a chick bursting from an eggshell. Quote, people are pushing from inside. The shell is getting thinner and thinner. Now, this pamphlet is titled Reading Legitimation Crisis in Tehran, not Legitimation Crisis in Tehran. though the latter would certainly be worth writing. What I'm undertaking here is not a Habermasian analysis of present-day Iran, but rather a meditation on why and how thinkers like Habermas, thinkers like Hannah Arendt, thinkers like Isaiah Berlin, and indeed Karl Popper, are read by Iranian intellectuals today, and what those ideas look like when refracted back to us through a Persian prism. Our dilemma, the Iranian political theorist Javad Tabatabai has said, our dilemma is to understand the gap that has developed between us, meaning Iran, and the West since the Renaissance. We need, he says, to relink to this part of our tradition that also inspired the West. We can reread the great medieval Islamic philosopher-scientist Ibn Sina Avresina, for example, with a Western horizon in mind, unquote. Now, what I propose is, in a sense, the mirror image of Tabatabai's suggestion. That is to say, that we in the West should relink to the thinkers in our tradition who have inspired Iran, and thus reread Habermas and Berlin with a Persian horizon in mind. In chapter 3 of this book, I attempt to do, actually chapter 2, which I'll be reading from parts of in a moment, I sort of attempt to do that. Now, readers will, I hope, forgive me for the simultaneously obscure and coy title of this pamphlet. Of course, it's a play on the titles of two books, the aforementioned Legitimation Crisis and Azar Nafizi's widely read 2003 memoir, and I should say hotly debated memoir, Reading Lolita in Tehran. I chose the title in order to evoke both the actual legitimation crisis, but more centrally, the intellectual ferment taking place in Iran today. Nafizi's book analyzes that ferment from a literary angle, whereas my focus is on the philosophical and political ideas that are in play in Iran today. I argue that we are at a pivotal moment, not only in geopolitical terms, but also in terms of how we are to make sense of and relate to what's happening politically and intellectually inside Iran today. There's an extraordinary intellectual upheaval taking place in Iran, what Ramin Jahanbegloo calls a renaissance of liberalism. Most Western leftists are not merely unaware of this phenomenon, but more to the point, and for reasons I attempt to explain in this volume, they're stuck in interpretive frameworks that blind them to its contours. Amidst the wave of repression currently convulsing the country, moreover, Iranian dissidents and human rights activists are actively seeking the support of people around the world for their embattled struggles. Not, as I'll discuss in a moment, the support of Western governments, but of intellectuals, writers, and NGOs. That is to say, from the kinds of people in the room tonight. There is an astonishing degree of confusion over this extremely elementary and yet vital distinction amongst large swaths of the Western left, and it is a confusion with quite serious consequences. So, in the summer and fall of 2006, Akbar Ganji, Iran's preeminent dissident, traveled to Europe and North America to raise awareness of the human rights situation back home and to seek support for the democratic struggle that his own story has in many ways come to represent. Ganji had spent the first half of the decade as a political prisoner, locked in solitary confinement inside Tehran's notorious Evin prison. Possessing intimate knowledge from his own treatment of the conditions Iran's dissidents routinely face in prison, he decided to hold a 3-day hunger strike in front of the United Nations in solidarity with 3 particular Iranian political prisoners, each symbolizing the plights of distinct fronts in the Iranian struggle. I've mentioned all 3 of them already, the aforementioned trade unionist Mansour Osanlu, the philosopher Ramin Jahanbegloo, and the former student leader and ex-parliamentarian Ali Akbar Mousavi Khoeni. In coordination with Ganji's action, parallel hunger strikes were held in cities around the world, from Toronto and Paris to Stockholm and Berlin. While abroad, Ganji also delivered a series of talks at universities, including not only the University of Chicago, but right here in this building in September, to groups like Amnesty International and PEN. And he met one-on-one with several intellectuals. Now, significantly, and to Ganji's great credit, he declined invitations to meet with heads of state, including an invitation from the White House, explaining that he sought the support of NGOs, civil society, and intellectuals, not governments. He veered clear of the corridors of power and made himself useless to the neoconservatives who fancy themselves the esteemed allies of Iranian Democrats. This, I should say, while they go to bat for a Stalinist Islamist cult group once funded by Saddam Hussein and officially deemed a terrorist organization by the State Department. Yes, you heard that right. The organization is called the Mujahideen-e-Khalq, for those of you familiar with it. I should just repeat that in case it sounded too bizarre to be true. The neocons, indeed, are in one of their pet projects. If you have the displeasure of following these things as closely as I do, you know that one of the pet projects of several neocons in Washington is to decriminalize and legitimate this organization, the MEK, Mujahideen al-Khalq, which has a long history that I won't go into now. But it is indeed, to cut a long story short, a Stalinist Islamist cult organization that was on the payroll of Saddam Hussein for 27 years, and is officially, to this day, considered a terrorist organization by the U.S. State Department. And the neocons have been lobbying the State Department very aggressively to get that organization removed from the list of terrorist organizations. Why? Because it's against the Iranian government. The neocons who tried to convince the world that they represented a departure from the amoral realpolitik logic of the foreign policy establishment in the name of idealism and human rights and democracy have absolutely no trouble going to bed with a murderous death cult that our own government considers a terrorist group. If ever there was any question about where the neocons are coming from, I think this case study illuminates a great deal. Now, if Ganji shunned the neoconservatives, he was, with one important exception, which I'll discuss in a moment, no more eager to cross-pollinate with the West's radical intelligentsia. Which intellectuals Ganji chose as interlocutors on his tour is highly illuminating and goes to the heart of this book's argument. It's no accident that in Germany, Ganji made a point of meeting with Habermas, whose influence in Iranian dissident and intellectual circles is towering, probably greater than that of any other living thinker. This is due in no small measure to the philosopher's 2000 tour visit to Iran, which I discuss both in Chapter 2 and also in my dialogue with Ramin Jahanbegloo, who was there. While in Germany, Ganji also met with Shmuel Eisenstadt, the theorist of multiple modernities. The theme of modernity, tajadod in Persian, looms large in Iranian intellectual life. In fact, it's striking how often it pops up, not only in the theoretical literature, but more broadly in public discourse. Imagine that word appearing regularly in the Chicago Tribune or something on that order. I mean, literally, the newspaper that I mentioned earlier that was shut down over the summer, Sharg, which was Iran's leading reformist publication until its closing. Imagine a mass circulation daily newspaper in Chicago or even in New York or Washington that has in its employ a, quote, theoretical editor. That's right, Sharg, the Iranian reformist daily newspaper, had his official title was theoretical editor. He's a friend of mine, Ali Mouassami. In London, Ganji sought out neither Tariq Ali nor George Galloway. Rather, he met with the liberal internationalists Mary Kaldor and David Held of the London School of Economics and the social theorist and former LSE director Anthony Giddens. As it happens, Held's book, Models of Democracy, hardly part of the left canon, has been translated into Persian and is widely read by Iranian intellectuals and journalists. Giddens is, of course, held in near universal contempt on the left for his writings on the Third Way and his role as court intellectual for Tony Blair, but his work on modernity, his sociological writings enjoy a sizable readership in Iran. In Canada, Ganji sought out Charles Taylor, another philosopher to whose writings one finds references sprinkled throughout contemporary Iranian thought, and whose politics belong decidedly in the democratic pluralist rather than the Marxist camp. In the U.S., Ganji met with Richard Rorty, who has also lectured in Iran and enjoys a substantial following there, which we also discuss, Ramin Jahanbegloo and I, in Chapter 4. Rorty once playfully described his own politics as a kind of, quote, postmodernist bourgeois liberalism. He is a Deweyan, Dissent magazine-style social democrat, solidly on the left of the American political schemata, but considered hopelessly tepid by most self-styled radicals. Ganji also met with the sociologist Robert Bellah, as well as the philosopher Martha Nussbaum, right here in this building. The other American thinker with whom Ganji met, and the only unambiguously radical one, was Noam Chomsky. In one sense, it was a peculiar choice, since liberalism tends to speak more to Iranian intellectuals than does radicalism. And yet Chomsky is personally held in very high regard amongst many Iranian intellectuals. Again, Jahanbegloo and I discussed this in some length in our dialogue in this book. And Chomsky, one should note, was admonished by numerous radicals not to meet with Ganji, on the grounds that the Iranian dissident was insufficiently critical of neoliberalism and U.S. imperialism. To his great credit, Chomsky ignored those admonitions and engaged in what my friend Fred Halliday calls critical solidarity with Ganji. He not only asked his fellow dissident what we, that is to say Western supporters of the democratic struggle in Iran, can do to help, which I consider an absolutely vital gesture, one that virtually no one else on the left has made, I should say, for reasons that I discuss in Chapter 1 of this book. Chomsky went further, suggesting to Ganji that he formulate a more concrete program outlining the Iranian democratic movement's goals and how it proposes to go about realizing them. Ganji took up the idea, and the two men agreed to continue their dialogue. Now, I have some disagreements with Chomsky, but to my mind, this was simply an exemplary political moment, an expression of exactly the kind of critical solidarity so sorely lacking on both the liberal and the radical left today, in my view. Precious few leftists today have more than a vague clue who Ganji even is. Go to the websites of The Nation, In These Times, The Progressive, New Left Review, pick your favorite left-wing publication and search for his name. Simply type Gangi into the search box and see how many times he's even mentioned, let alone how many profiles of him or essays on him will appear. The answer, by the way, is 0, if you are curious. Thus, the leading dissident figure in a country at the center of geopolitical drama is effectively off the radar of the left. How are we to make sense of this state of affairs? Now, to be fair, if you go to the website of the Marxist magazine Monthly Review, you will find Ganji discussed in a smear job, attacking him for having insufficiently anti-capitalist credentials. At least they can't be accused of ignoring him. But to be really fair, Amy Goodman had Ganji on her widely listened to radio show Democracy Now! And did quite a good interview with him. I have to admit being slightly surprised by this, although pleasantly so, for 2 reasons. First, because Goodman, like most American leftists, views Iran largely through an American prism, the prism of American imperialism, which is no less an American prism. It's no less an American prism for being critical as opposed to uncritical of U.S. foreign policy. Anti-imperialism can become a form, if an inverted one, of imperialism. For both, it's all about the United States. Likewise, anti-Orientalism can turn into a form of Orientalism, as Janet Afari and Kevin Anderson argue it did for Foucault in his encounter with the Iranian Revolution, an episode I discuss in Chapter 3 of this book. But the more proximate cause for my surprise was that when Amy Goodman interviewed Shirin Ebadi in June of 2004, she was exclusively interested in the latter's criticisms of U.S. foreign policy, specifically Washington's support for Saddam Hussein during the Iran-Iraq War, while sidestepping Ebadi's thoughts on the internal political situation in Iran. In this same vein, consider the following. Ebadi went on a speaking tour in the spring of 2006 to discuss her recently published autobiography, Iran Awakening. As someone who every day of every week defends the victims of the regime's brutal abuses, indeed as someone who has done jail time herself for engaging in that work, the issue of the Islamic Republic's human rights practices tends to feature rather centrally in her scheme of things, not hard to imagine why. Which is not to say that it's the only issue on her agenda, or that it in any way blunts her criticisms of the United States and its foreign policy. Quite the contrary. She has spoken out in no uncertain terms against the Iraq War, the detainee base in Guantanamo, and the torture inflicted by U.S. soldiers at Abu Ghraib, and has made it utterly clear that she opposes any U.S. intervention in Iran whatsoever. In fact, she has said right here in Chicago and elsewhere all over the world, she says, as oppressed as those of us struggling for human rights and democracy in Iran are by our regime, we will defend it with every last drop of blood in our bodies from an outside invasion. Now, despite this, at a public event for her book in London over the spring-summer, an anti-war activist instructed her that she should not denounce Iran's human rights record, indeed not discuss it at all, explaining that doing so only plays into the hands of the warmongers and fuels the fires of imperialism. Ebadi upbraided her would-be sage in the strongest possible terms, leaning over the lectern and waving her finger at the activist. She made plain that any anti-war movement that advocates silence in the face of tyranny, for whatever reason, can count her out. This is what the philosopher Slavoj Žižek, I think, very aptly captures in his expression, against the double blackmail, right? Being against Western imperialism in no way requires one to side with its ostensible other on the other side of that equation, which in fact, according to Žižek, is not, in most cases, anything like an other. It's usually a mirror image and in many cases a product, a direct product of the global capitalist system. This book is an attempt to diagnose the mindset of that anti-war activist in London and the many others on the left who are conflicted and flummoxed about Iran. That is to say, insofar as anti-imperialism is the guiding conceptual prism through which many of us on the left make sense of the world, make sense of geopolitical conflict, understandable as that is. Insofar as anti-imperialism is the conceptual framework that we use to interpret the world, Iran becomes a very complicated case, doesn't it? Because Ahmadinejad sounds like an anti-imperialist, doesn't he? He denounces the United States, he criticizes George Bush, he expresses passionate opposition to U.S. hegemony in the world. And yet, Ahmadinejad is on the far right of Iranian politics. He does not represent emancipatory politics. He represents authoritarian and repressive politics, the politics of reaction. The people who represent an emancipatory vision in Iran are in fact the people like Shirin Ebadi, Akbar Ganji, human rights activists, student activists, dissident intellectuals, political prisoners, bloggers and journalists trying to make sense of a way out of theocratic repression and towards something like democratic pluralism. Insofar then as anti-imperialism is this, it can be, let me just make it clear, I'm not against anti-imperialism. I am an anti-imperialist myself, and it's important to point out that the most famous figure, the most famous anti-imperialist figure in 20th century Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, who was the victim of a Anglo-American CIA-engineered coup that destroyed democracy in Iran when it already had it. Okay? Mohammad Mossadegh was not a Marxist or an Islamist. He was a liberal Democrat and a nationalist, to be sure. but he was a liberal Democrat. In fact, he was anti-Marxist, although as a good liberal pluralist, believed that there should be room for Marxists in an open society, and so had Marxists even in his own coalition, the National Front. But he himself was not a Marxist. In other words, liberalism has a very strong anti-imperialist tradition, specifically in Iran and elsewhere, that it has sadly forgotten in many ways. And part of what I try to do in this book is to try to recover and revive the radical anti-imperialist traditions within liberalism. This book is an attempt to explain why Ganji and other Iranian dissidents gravitate towards liberal rather than Marxist intellectuals, and what lessons there might be in this about how to think about Iran today. It is an attempt to understand why, in his essays and speeches, Ganji invokes the figures of Kant, Mill, and Camus, while often criticizing, although in a very interesting and engaging way, those of Marx, Sartre, and Marcuse, of whom there is a portrait hanging over my desk in my office, I should say. Now, lest I in any way leave the impression that I have a kind of uncritical celebration of Iranian intellectuals embracing of Western liberalism, I should say there's a whole section of Chapter 2 in which I try to engage in my own kind of critical solidarity with my Iranian comrades and counterparts, in which I say, wait a minute, let's not idealize the liberal tradition. There are some very serious shortcomings and problems with it. And yet, nonetheless, what I'm trying to do in this book is to understand why Iranian intellectuals and dissidents and human rights activists are drawn to liberal thinkers and not to Marxist ones. It's critical that we think through these questions, I argue, not only because of the pressing situation Iran faces today, externally as well as internally, but because of their relevance for the progressive project itself, which is something I also try to outline in the book. I should check the time. We're probably getting close to 8 o'clock. There's a lot else I wanted to read, but I think I took too long already, no? I mean 7 o'clock, I'm sorry, that's what I meant to say. But I should only go, I was told I should. The problem is that the other part that I would have read and sort of thought about reading tonight is itself about 45 minutes, and it would be hard to kind of chop through that. But perhaps in the discussion, in the question and answer session, I can... actually, okay, there is one section. There's one very rich story that I just want to quickly tell about the Italian Marxist philosopher Antonio Negri going to Tehran almost exactly 2 years ago, January 2005, and the experience that he had here. Okay. A painfully salient illustration of Western radicalism's general irrelevance to contemporary Iran can be found in Antonio Negri's visit to that country in January of 2005 to deliver a series of lectures. Given the intellectually omnivorous climate in Iran today, it's no surprise that Negri was invited to lecture in Iran and that his talks were well attended. In fact, I should say it was Ramin Jahanbegloo himself, very much a self-identified liberal, not a Marxist, who invited Negri. And people will say, as I do to Ramin in our dialogue, I say, so Ramin, what is this fascination you have with Negri? I mean, you guys have such different political worldviews. And, this is the interesting thing about Ramin. He says, well, yeah, but I just love his interpretation of Spinoza. It's just so sublime. This is the kind of thing that one hears very characteristically in conversations with Iranian intellectuals. They're actually in some ways more interested in Spinoza and Hegel than in talking, political strategy, which is, as some Iranian friends of mine would say, this is part of a problem, not necessarily has certain shortcomings. But in any case, so it's interesting that it was a liberal, anti-Marxist philosopher, Ramin Jahanbegloo, who brought Negri to Tehran. But most of those who gathered to hear Negri speak, found what the radical had to say, quote, and this is a quote from Nina Power, who wrote a very interesting account of the Negri visit to Iran, cleverly titled Persian Empire. Get it? Negri and Hart's book, Empire? Persian Empire. I should say that Nina Power herself is a radical leftist, a friend of Negri's, and wrote this account in the Marxist journal Radical Philosophy. So this is not, I'm not quoting some, John Stuart Mill scholar here. This is a left-wing radical take on Negri's experience in Tehran. Nina Power described the way Negri's message came across in Tehran as, quote, oddly tangential to Iran's most pressing concerns. With the country's, quote, this is still Power, with the country's widespread suspicion of classical Marxist or revolutionary solutions, she adds, what exactly does Antonio Negri have to say to Iran? Most of the audience saw, quote, little of relevance in his communicative, productive model of mass political agency to what is, in many ways, a society constrained at virtually all levels by a ubiquitous, if internally riven, state. Negri's concept of radicalism, writes Power, appears to possess, quote, I love this, no frontal relation to the constraints of the existing order in Iran. Now, here's the most interesting part. If anything, Negri's message appealed more to the religious hard right and Iranian reactionaries. Also true of Heidegger, by the way, interestingly, for very different reasons. Heidegger is sort of the official Western philosopher of the clerical theological class in Iran. And that's not something recent, actually. Heidegger was translated, Being and Time was translated into Persian 3 decades before it was translated into most European languages. There's been a deep and very long-standing engagement with European philosophy in Iran throughout the 20th century and before. If there is to be, this is quote, once again a quote from Nina Power, if there is to be a new Iranian revolution from below, it is unlikely to take the form of a plebeian carnival or quasi-biblical exodus. These are all plays on some of Negri and Hart's concepts. And I'm just going to quote one other part of this essay in which I try to explain. Yes. Okay. There have been more translations of Kant into Persian in the last decade, according to the Iranian scholar Vali Nasr, than into any other language. And these have gone into multiple printings. Abdollah Momeni, the leader of Iran's most prominent student activist group, Daftar-e-Tarkim-e-Wadat, claims Habermas as his chief inspiration. Indeed, there are often, quote, more vibrant resonances of continental thought in places like Iran, notes the political theorist Fred Dahlmeier, than can be found in Europe today. In a rich elaboration on this point, Dahlmeier observes, quote, this does not mean that European perspectives are simply disseminated across the world without reciprocity or reciprocal learning, nor does it mean that local origins are simply erased in favor of a bland universalism. What it does mean is that landscapes and localities undergo symbolic metamorphoses, and that experiences once localized at a given place increasingly find echoes or resonance chambers among distant societies and peoples. End of quote. One would be hard-pressed to find a more luminous illustration of Dahlmeier's point than contemporary Iran. In the words of the Iranian scholar Farideh Farhi, there is a, quote, elaborate and extremely rich conversation that has taken shape in Iran in the past few years concerning the requirements of a democratic and transparent political system and the relationship between faith and freedom. The Iranian political scientist Mehrdad Mashayehi describes, quote, an epoch-making renaissance in Iran's political culture and discourse. As I mentioned earlier, Jahan Beglu says that there is nothing less than a renaissance of liberalism taking place in Iran today. And in fact, I would argue that Jahan Beglu's own work and life perfectly embody that intellectual conversation between Iran and the outside world. In addition to publishing books of conversations in English, Ramin is fluent in 3 languages, Persian, actually 4, Persian, Azeri, which is the Turkic language of many million Iranians, and French and English. And Ramin has published books in Persian, English, and French. In English, he's published a book of conversations with Isaiah Berlin by that title, very interesting book, and a book that just came out while he was in prison, tragically, although perhaps poetically, a book of conversations with the Indian philosopher Ashish Nandi. Very interesting book called Talking India. I should say that Ramin he left Iran to do his PhD at the Sorbonne, but rather than looking west or trying to cut his teeth on Western thought, Ramin did his dissertation at the Sorbonne on Gandhi. Interesting choice. So, in French, he's published a book of conversations with George Steiner, and he's written books in Persian on Machiavelli, Kant, Hegel, Schopenhauer, Tagore, and in French, his dissertation on Gandhi, aux sources de la non-violence, Gandhi on the sources of nonviolence. As well, he has brought an endless stream. This is the part that's actually most interesting. It's not just Ramin's books, it's what he does. I think of Ramin as a philosophical ambassador between Iran and the outside world. He has brought an endless stream of Western intellectuals to lecture in Iran. Among them Ashish Nandi, Fred Dahlmeyer, Richard Rorty, Agnes Heller, Negri, and Timothy Garton Ash. Many, many others as well I don't have time to mention. And it's worth noting that Ramin was thanked, in a sense, by the Ahmadinejad government for these activities by being thrown in prison. Now, why is there such an intense interest in these authors in Iran today? How do books like Popper's Open Society and Its Enemies and Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism speak to contemporary Iranians? Do the ideas of Habermas and Berlin look the same to Iranian intellectuals and dissidents as they do to us? And of the many Western intellectual political currents, and of the many intellectual political currents emanating from the West today, Marxism, post-structuralism, post-colonialism, subaltern studies, and various blends thereof. I should say, of course, subaltern studies and post-colonial studies didn't emanate from the West. As my friend Vinay Lal corrected me, of course, they didn't emanate from the West, but they have a very strong place in Western academic life, as we all know. And so of all of these currents, why is it that liberalism is the most popular school of political thought amongst Iranian intellectuals at this historical moment? And rather than unpack that, I will simply tease you with letting you know that the next 30 pages or so of that essay are my attempt to explain why I think that is. And then in the next 15 pages or so, I try to kind of turn back then and say, okay, but what would a blend? In a sense, the entire project, and I'll close with this, in a sense, the entire project of this book is to take what I consider the best and most liberatory aspects of liberal theory and criticize the most regressive, dead weight of the liberal tradition. And also the same with the radical tradition, be it Marxist, anarchist, or loosely defined socialist. In the radical tradition, what are the best, most emancipatory, most vibrant and living aspects of radical politics today, and what are the parts that are blinding us from understanding what's happening in a place like Iran? And so in the end of that chapter, I try to outline what I call a radical liberalism, or a liberal third worldism, or I play around with different titles, social democratic internationalism. I'm just sort of, I get a little bit frolicsome with words. And my favorite one, actually, I should say, I'm slightly proud of having coined this. I like to refer to myself sometimes as an uber-Menshevik. In fact, I proposed as the title of this pamphlet, the Uber-Menshevik Manifesto. And Marshall Solins, my publisher, and Matt Engelke, my editor, had to have what the British like to call a quiet word with me about that. They said, Danny, see if you can slip that in somewhere into the text. It's not going on the title page. So this is my moment. This is the Uber-Menshevik moment, as it were. So in a sense, what this book is about, it's not just about the story of Iranian liberalism and the struggle of Iranian intellectuals and dissidents and human rights activists today. It is certainly centrally about that. But it's also about what those of us outside of Iran, I think, can learn from what's happening inside Iran today and how we can rethink our own politics in a self-critical way towards a new synthesis. And so for your attention, I really thank you.